Next, we're going to add an empty for our armature to follow. I'm going to Shift A to add an empty. First, select our armature, then Shift select the empty, and Control P to parent to object. So we're just going to test it out, and it's moving along with the empty as we wanted, so that's fantastic. Now let's focus on streaming two animations together. We're going to go to the dope sheet and select the action editor. Currently we're in T-pose mode. So I'll select the armature here. We're going to go to the flying animation and Control C to copy. Then select the jump up animation. I decided to start this at 5 frames after the end of the jump up. So we're just going to select this button here to duplicate this animation, which changes this to jump.001. We're going to rename it as jump to flight. And Control V to paste those animations in. So we can see that after 5 frames, it merges into the flight animation, but I want him to fly upward instead of forward. So what we will do is go into pose mode, select the hips and rotate them 90 degrees and I to insert. Now, if we bring it back a few frames, we will see that his hip location at the end of our jump up does not match the flying hip location. So we're going to go back to frame 26, and with the hip so selected, we're going to Shift S cursor to selected, then go back to frame 30 and Shift S selection to cursor. That puts him in the proper position between the two animations so that they match up. So let's go ahead and play that back and see what we got. I'm going to set the end frame animation to 109 and play it. Just scrub through this a little bit. Everything seems to be in working order. And now we need to animate our empty. As I was saying earlier, the feet don't line up with the exact 0 of the Z-axis. So for this particular animation, I went ahead and pulled it up just a bit. Now, if I were doing a more extensive setup of this animation, I would have actually made sure that both feet were planted on the ground, but this is a quick and dirty process. So test that out. Seems to be okay. His foot's still popping through, and ironically that got fixed during the compositing process on the back end, so that's why I wasn't too worried about it, but it is noticeable now. Then we'll jump back to frame 1, I to insert. So this is going to be his starting position. We go all the way up to frame 30. This is where the flight portion of the animation begins. We're going to I to insert. So what's going to happen is beyond this point is when he shoots upward. But we want him to complete the jump animation and transition into the flight just as the jetpack kicks on. So we're going to go all the way to the end of this animation. And in grid snap, we're going to pull him all the way up here. Now, depending on how high you want him to go is completely up to you. And finally, I to insert. Now, upon playing this back, it seemed a bit slow. but it improved after you hover over the action editor window, press T, and set it to linear. So we'll play that back. So it's not a slow climb, now it's moving at a consistent rate. I moved the animation time down to 70 for a moment, thinking that he wasn't moving fast enough, but after watching it through several times, I noticed that it was totally fine, and I bumped it back up to 109. We're going to add a camera, bring it back a little bit. And while the camera is still selected, we're going to go into the Constraints tab and add Track 2, which in this case, I'm going to select the armature and it will be the hips. So I'm going to pull this back up to its original point. So now that the animation is complete, we can move on to setting up our fire and smoke simulation. I'm just going to click this to make our data block for our jump to flight permanent. Then we'll go back into T-pose. I'm going to hide this cube. We're going to zero in on our armature here and focus on the jetpack. Now the nozzles are already selected from a while back when we added them in. So what we're going to do is brush select these two center circles here, shift duplicate. I'm in grid snap mode, so I'm just going to turn that off. They are selected, and P to separate selection. Then we're going to Object, set Origin to Geometry, and apply the scale, and followed by bringing them down a little bit. Then I'm going to rename them to Flame Emitter. Alt P to clear parent and keep transform so that I can parent them to the jetpack itself rather than the spine. We also don't need these materials, so we can just delete those. One thing I forgot to mention earlier when working on the jetpack was to set the origin to geometry. You can see that it's done now, but if you haven't already, go ahead and do that and move on to the next step. Then we're going to Shift A and add a cube. Go into wireframe mode. Go into edit mode. Scale it down to 0.4. Jump back into object mode. Pull it back. Go into edit mode again. Select this back face here and pull it in. I lined it up about 3-ish notches wide. Select the bottom face and pull it down pretty far. And we're doing this so that the smoke trails have a good amount of distance. Followed by applying the scale. Then we're going to shift select our armature, go into pose mode, and select the spine 1, and Control P to parent to bone. Control Tab out of pose mode, and we're going to set the origin to geometry for this cube and apply the scale one more time. The armature and change it to jump to flight. You can see that the angle of our cube changes with the spine, which is exactly what we wanted. Select the cube, and we are going to add a fluid sim domain. For the resolution, if I zoom out, you'll see here it is this size. And I'm going to set it to 256. We're going to scroll down to the Fire tab and set the flame smoke setting to 3. And lastly, select Adaptive Domain. Then we're going to select our flame emitter and add another fluid sim, but this time it will be flow. Set it to fire and smoke, inflow, check initial velocity, and I used a Z velocity of -70, and that should give it a lot of downward thrust. Otherwise, a lot of the smoke and the flame will collect at the bottom. So let's test that out. Just as a side note, when you are editing the scale of the cube in any way, do not do it in object mode. It has to be done in edit mode, and be sure to apply the scale. Switch to the camera view here. That looks really good, and the fact that the domain is smaller gave more room for the bake to focus on twin flame output. I'm happy with the results. Now we can move on to the last step, which is applying the materials for our smoke sim. And on the back end of that, I will show you how I rendered this all out, as well as how it was put back together in the sequencer. So let's move on to our smoke materials. So I want to take a moment to apologize to any Eevee users. I personally do not like the way that it looks in Eevee, so from this point on, we're actually going to jump over to cycles. And there are many tutorials available for Eevee flames, but still, I personally don't think they look nearly as good, so it just is what it is on that one. And like I said, I apologize, but that's the direction we're going to go. So go into the shader editor with the domain selected. And the first thing I want to do is add an HDRI to our background so that we have a more realistic lighting for our scene here. You can also get those from Polyhaven as well. Feel free to use any one you like. For the initial setup, I use this HDRI that has a terrain at the bottom just to have an idea on how it all looks, but I eventually moved over to one that has the sky, but there's no terrain at the bottom. Now we can jump over to cycles here. We can see that the default for our samples is way too high, at least for my computer. So I'm going to just drop this down to 16 for testing purposes, and for the render I have it set to 32. And we will then go back to the object shader with our domain selected. We're going to delete this principled BSDF and instead add a principled volume node. Connect volume to volume. We need another node, which will be an add shader. We're going to connect that in between these two. And then we will add an emission shader. Bring that down to here. We need two more nodes. First will be a volume info node, and the second will be a math node. We go to converter, math, set this to multiply. We'll connect flame to the top input. And connect emission to the second shader input on our add shader. Give it a color. I'm just going to scrub through the frames here till we get to the point where we have some output, and I'll base my value on that. To get the smoke to come up, I set the density to 200, and then we go down to our emission and we're going to bump this up to 75. And I wanted to play around with the flame color. I didn't think it looked quite right at first, so I just messed around with that for a moment until I found something that seemed not overly bright and definitely looked like flames. You know, I kind of wanted it to complement the smoke. And I'm just going to do a quick render to see how this looks. And I apologize, you can't see the results because I have OBS recording the Blender screen, so it's not pulling up the render window as well. But ultimately, I felt that it looked good enough to move forward. So if you're happy with your results, go ahead and bake your smoke simulation. And now we can take a look at how this was all rendered. All right, so let's take a look at these render files. I rendered it in Ping because I had no plans on doing anything fancy by rendering it in EXR. So if we just go through, so we have the background, Rocketeer himself. I used motion blur, just the default settings, nothing fancy. So we see him going up. I will say, if we bring him back down, I have to set up my render settings a very specific way so that the light from the jetpack and the flames, which was coming down about here, was also emitted onto the back of his pants so that we see some light essentially coming from the flames. So I don't know why it took me a bit of time to get that right, but it's just because I've never done a render like that, so I didn't particularly understand how to set it up initially. And then we'll take a look at the smoke sim. Looking at it from this angle, it kind of looks like cotton. And these are all the fluid sims that I created. I'm going to have to delete a lot of these because they're just not relevant. Well, the only one that is relevant is this one here. All the rest of these are just deletable. So go ahead and get rid of those. Sorry you had to see me do that on the fly. Let's look at the blend file itself. Oh, wrong one. Let's look at the blend file itself. So as you can see, to pull this off, what I had to do was, depending on what mesh it is and the given situation, all of these have the same, well, as far as the, for the terrain, the cube, and the background HDRI, I just turned everything off and rendered everything as is. The reason why this material setup is used in this format is so that when I went to render the scene itself, I still got the shadows from the HDRI shining down upon the character. So in order for me to maintain those, I had to basically say, hey, the camera doesn't see him, but still the environment is going to affect any obstacle that he happens to be close to. For the Rocketeer, from what we saw earlier, I rendered him on his own using this transparent setting, which is turned on at the moment. I can actually go ahead and turn that off. And so he is all we would see for the output. And to get the flame emission to appear on the pants, I had to set it up like this, where we have, all the material stuff that we used before, but just the same technique with a array of the light path and just plug that into the mix shader as a factor. We have our transparent as the main, and then the shader itself as the secondary. So that's what allowed the light from the flames to pass on to the pants, even though it was rendered transparent, because I needed it to show up. It just was not gonna have that sense of realism. And then when it came to rendering the um, outside of the Rocketeer, just making him invisible so that I could render, because what am I trying to say here? So when you have this set up, you can have it just turned off by render, or depending on what you're doing, you could also make it transparent or make it invisible to the camera so that you can kind of do separate renders. So in this case, I needed to use the is camera ray so that it filtered out different parts of the mesh, and see everything that has to do with the Rocketeer has this same setup. The only one that has a different connection is the domain, which is a diffuse ray. So using these different node setups, I was able to render out those 3 different examples, which I showed you there. So we take a look at the scene that we have now. We have our background, the volume, which I brought back into Blender and rendered it as an animation simply so that I could denoise the smoke sim a little bit more. When I looked at it initially, I made that little joke about it looking like cotton candy, and you could tell that it was just still too noisy. Even though I did render it with a denoise, it still came out a bit too noisy. And then of course we have the Rocketeer himself, who is on top of both of those. So, if I do that, then background goes. If we bump this up to about here, I brought the opacity down to 0.75, and I gave it just a few bumps with this modifier here, just so that I could get more effects from the flames themselves. Mainly just altering the brightness of them. So by default, they looked like this, and I needed a little more of that flame effect. So I just brought that up just a hair, and obviously I left this alone because it's affecting the entire scene, and there wasn't really any need for me to use the lift anyway. So no changes were made to the Rocketeer himself. I didn't need any modifiers. Same thing with the background, no modifiers necessary. And that's how we ended up with our final result. I think the motion blur really helped. All right, so we have now completed the Rocketeer jump to flight tutorial. We've covered building the mesh up, getting it rigged, setting up the materials and the animations, and as well as what was done in order to get this rendered based on my computer's capabilities. And if you happen to have a faster computer, then there are some areas where you can kind of skip, I'm sure. So don't forget to comment below, like and subscribe, and as always, thanks for watching.